Sticking with the resignation of Gary Cohn, we're now joined by Allan Lichtman. He's a professor of history at the American University. Thanks for joining us, Allan.
My pleasure.
So let's start with this idea of Gary Cohn leaving. Obviously, last summer there were some concerns that he was going to leave. He stayed. He shepherded through the tax cuts. But a lot of people have said, don't worry about the White House because the best and the brightest are advising the president. Mr. Cohn, one of the best and brightest, now out the door. Should we be concerned?
I think we should be very concerned. Donald Trump lives in a fantasy world. This notion that he is surrounded by the best and the brightest is absolute nonsense. If you look at his appointment, it's strewn with people who are utterly unqualified for their jobs. Several have had to withdraw their nominations. And if you look at the White House itself, he's really down to hardliners like General John Kelly and Stephen Miller, members of his family. There's hardly anyone there who you would say was one of the best people and a truly outstanding advisor. Gary Cohn would have fit that bill, and he's gone.
And obviously, all the talk has been about the fact that Gary Cohn was looking at the idea of tariffs on aluminum, on steel, of getting tough on trade, basically globally with China and other partners is not such a great idea. Was trying to push the president in another direction. It seems that he just got frustrated with it all and just pulled up stakes. So it seems that we now have an even more protectionist White House in our hands.
That's right. And truly, what Donald Trump is doing with protectionism is firing the wrong gun at the wrong target. He is repudiating the legacy of the greatest Republican of recent times, and that is Ronald Reagan. Traditionally, the Republican Party had been the protectionist party, really going back 100 years or so, and Ronald Reagan reversed that and moved the Republican Party into the modern era of free trade. Now, Donald Trump wants to turn back the clock. And we know that protectionism and steel tariffs are a very bad idea. We can look as recently as the 2002 tariffs from George W. Bush, which didn't work and actually hurt the economy. And a number of former Bush officials are urging Donald Trump not to do this.
When we talk about leadership, whether it's political or corporate, obviously leaders surround themselves with, you would hope, voices that aren't identical to the way they think, that they can perhaps show them different paths. Donald Trump saying, don't worry, we're going to fill this role, the best and the brightest. The top people are clamoring to be in this role. What are the chances he actually appoints someone who will challenge his views rather than just a yes man?
I think the chances are quite minimal. He's surrounded now by yes men. He doesn't really have in the White House people of stature who really present to him alternative policy kinds of viewpoints. I've heard his defenders say, well, the reason you have all of these departures is Donald Trump's likes a real clash of ideas. Not true at all. Donald Trump likes people who will support him, who will put him in the spotlight. Donald Trump cares most of all about himself and about adulation.
There's a great sense, too, that even outside of the White House, in Congress, the House Republicans, not crazy about the idea of trade protectionism, of tariffs. They see how it can damage certain parts of the economy. What strength do they have to push back against President Trump?
Well, you can see many House and Senate Republicans very unhappy with this. But the record of Republicans pushing back against Donald Trump is an abysmal one. There is an utter lack of courage and a lack of principle among Republicans in the Congress of the United States. And while they might huff and they might puff, I would be surprised if we saw any real action coming out of Republicans. And remember, we are talking about a minuscule proportion of American jobs in steel, 140,000 or so, and a small number in aluminum. We're talking about a vastly larger number of jobs in steel and aluminum dependent industries. And every independent economic analyst says, if he goes through with this move, and you never know with Donald Trump, because he's a master of deflection, it's going to hurt jobs and hurt the economy. And by the way, you know, he's railed on and on about China. China is a minuscule exporter of steel to the United States. It's not even in the top 5. And you know, of course, who is the main exporter of steel to the United States, our great ally, Canada.
And that's where the big concern is for us. And obviously, we're in the middle of renegotiating NAFTA. The president saying he was going to bring steel and aluminum as part of that talks as sort of a condition. How worried should we be as Canadians who rely on the free trade deal with the United States that Mr. Cohn is gone and that voice is out of the White House?
I think you should be extremely worried. And, you know, Donald Trump has told a host of falsehoods about our trade deficit. Our trade deficit is not $800 billion because that doesn't count exports of services. It's really somewhere between 600 and some odd billion dollars. And we don't have a trade deficit with Canada. We are about equal in terms of trade with Canada. And the other point is, imports don't necessarily hurt the country. For the most parts, we have imports because foreign producers are producing products at cheap prices that Americans want. And so this notion that a trade deficit or imports is necessarily a bad thing is another fantasy that Donald Trump has conjured up, along with his phony statistics about trade. And this isn't going to hurt China. Steel exports to the United States are a vanishingly small percentage of the GDP of China. It's going to hurt Mexico, Canada, South Korea, American allies far more.
All right, thanks for your time. Your insight as always, Allan.
Anytime.
That was Allan Lichtman, history professor at American University.